I am a sex-obsessed straight woman who has consumed way too much gay porn. And I also have invaded cis gay male spaces my entire life by being in them.
Hello and welcome to Cracked Ivory, a podcast about the feminist discourses in academic theory and popular culture.
I'm Talia Putt. I'm the author of Transradfem and your resident evil lesbian feminist.
I'm Emma Zaharuk, the blogger behind Dolphin Diaries, and your resident evil detrans lesbian. Today we also have a very lovely guest. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, I'm May Peterson, author of the Sacred Dark fantasy series, and I am a baby angel uke princess who has never done anything wrong in her life.
Alright. Awesome. So, today's podcast topic is something that happens to bridge a lot of aspects of our lives because, just like May, we are also, Talia and I, fiction authors. Therefore, we have participated and interacted with popular media, including fandom. We have encountered fandom before. And as it happens, today's episode will be very heavily about fandom and feminist discourses within fandom.
Okay, so in order to properly contextualize what we're doing over here and why we have picked the specific topic for this episode, let me just put into context. So we are effectively talking about a couple of discursive spaces, let's call them, that are in conversation with each other, that like overlap to a certain degree and like reinforce each other, even if it doesn't really quite seem that way at first glance, you know? So there has been also in recent times a certain interest in fandom from the academic side. You know, fan studies is an emerging discipline and a topic, and even if the specific study of fans and fandom was in itself an emerging discipline within academia, just the way in which people socially consume media now, you know, the consumption of media itself, of IP itself, has become a very social process that in and of itself is interesting and obviously I think we can all agree runs up against social dynamics that academics are interested in studying. So this is a very fruitful space for, like, you know, gleaning some insight or like developing some theory or some like useful observations when it comes to how all of these interrelated spaces interact. So we're fundamentally talking about author spaces, fan spaces, and to a degree certain academic discourses, all in conversation with each other and mutually reinforcing each other. And that leads to some very interesting places, doesn't it, Emma?
It does. So, the paper that we're going to be talking about today is The Influence of Transphobia, Homonationalism, and Anti-Asian Prejudice, Anti-BL, meaning boys love, Attitudes in English-Speaking Fandoms, written by Sam Aburime, published in 2024 in East Asian Journal of Popular Culture. Now,
that title alone.
May, Talia, have you ever heard of either this paper or any other paper by Sam Aburime or Sam Aburime themselves? Which, as a side note, we will be referring throughout this episode to Aburime with they-them. It is a they-them of ignorance, for which we apologize, as I was unable, in looking through Aburime's social profile, to find any mention of pronouns. So if they do contact us after the fact, we will issue a correction in the show notes, and we apologize if that is inaccurate. But anyway, have you heard of this paper or this person before?
I am a little familiar with Aburime from social media. I've seen them posting a little bit here and there. I think this is, you all talking about this paper is the first time I've heard of the paper, though.
I've encountered Sam Aburime in a few contexts. One of them specifically is in an area of great personal interest to me, but I imagine we'll get to that a little bit later. And I have, in fact, heard of this paper. It has been trotted out in more than one context in order to, let's just say, support a certain narrative of of social dynamics within fandom spaces that does not reflect my personal experience, and let's leave it there before we get into the actual meat of the thing.
Right, right, of course. So you might have heard if you were either involved or encountered fandom in any way, specifically as it relates to shipping and shipping within queer spaces. You may have encountered Aburime's previous paper, which is cited in this one, because this one, as I said, was published only last year, although it was submitted for publication in 2022. But they are kind of fairly similar in spirit. Before we begin, I should say, listener, that prior knowledge of fandom will probably greatly improve the listening experience. But regardless, I'll try to lay some groundwork. So, this paper concerns primarily Western fans of the boys' love genre. This is a genre of male-male romance, which is produced in East Asia, especially Japan, and it has become popular in the West. And the general sort of ideas associated with this genre is that it typically features little to no significant female characters, while its fan base is thought to be primarily women. This is important to the paper that we're going to discuss. So, to go over the main points of the paper, as you can tell from the title, it deals with, well, really, three things. Anti-BL attitudes, which is antipathy towards fans of, and the content itself, of boys' love genre, and also transphobia and homonationalism.
So already there, I know we haven't actually. We're only just still talking about the title, but I have to really talk about the whole murder, arson, jaywalking vibes there. I'm just saying.
We'll see this a lot, and before we say anything, I would like to sincerely thank Sam Aburime for providing a free copy of this paper on request. Academia should be accessible. This is probably the last complimentary thing I'll say about this paper. Nevertheless.
Oh my god.
my goodness.
Yeah.
So, yes, this is a preface that I have to make, and that I will continue to be making throughout this episode, as the resident reader of this paper, is that the scholarship is. There is no other way to put it. The scholarship is incredibly poor. So, the thing is, the two chief citations of this paper, which is to say that are cited most relevantly and most often, are Sam Aburime's previous paper, and at a website fujoshi.info, specifically their anti-Fujoshi page, which is a collation of Tumblr screenshots of people behaving badly, pulled quotes from said Tumblr screenshots, and also articles that are tangentially related to them but have themselves nothing to do with fandom in particular, for the most part. So this is obviously a paper about an online culture, so do not mistake this for me sneering at, having a Tumblr screenshot in a paper about a Tumblr behavior. That is not the issue. The issue is that this paper follows a very particular way of structuring an argument. It makes a claim, it then provides a screenshot or a link to a screenshot, or a Twitter post or something like that, of a person saying something that would verify this argument, and leaves it as that. At no point does Sam Aburime cite a survey or any numerical data or a paper that has done this, which leaves us with a very strange degree of intellectual rigor, wherein this paper basically just makes a claim, cites a person whose tweet supports this claim, and is like, see, this is what happens. But with the same level of intellectual rigor, I can make any claim. I can prove the Earth is flat like this.
Yeah, so just a butt in here as the resident anti-academic over here, whose essays admittedly do not follow a very rigorous citation standard. Now, personally, I don't have much of an issue with cultural commentary being done in this way, but that's the sort of sleight of hand here that I feel compelled to point out. Fundamentally, what Aburime is engaging in over here is more cultural commentary than rigorous academia.
Yes.
But, because of the way this information has been presented and structured, there is a certain costuming, let's call it performativity, actually. Isn't that a fun word? But yet there's a certain performativity of academic rigor that is happening over here that does not really line up with the information as presented. And like, look, I'm perfectly aware that like this is a topic where it is difficult to get rigorous surveys, hard data, like verified numbers and such on. Like, I have personally had to comment on online social dynamics plenty of times in my book, but I've always caveated it with like, this is my testimony. Like, I
Right.
may be presenting this information in about as persuasive a manner as I can, but I do make it clear at the outset that like, please treat this book as an extended autoethnography. I do refer to scholarship, and as in when I do my best to cite it in line. Let's just say. But I'm not making any pretensions that like my essays or my book are peer reviewed over here, and neither is this paper.
So it's funny you should mention testimony because it also notably lacks any first-hand testimony. Like it includes either by reference or directly a lot of screenshots, but it does not seem as though there has been any attempt to contact any of the people being screenshotted and receive direct testimony. So we are merely left with screenshots of their one sentence like vomit on the internet.
Decontextualized from a larger conversation on top of that.
Right, right. And more to the point, there are some claims that Aburime makes where achieving some numerical data, it may be flawed, but an attempt at numerical data would have been trivial, and it nonetheless is not attempted. We'll come back to that. But I want to exemplify the kind of scholarship that we're talking about and the way that Aburime attempts to present their arguments as persuasive and supported by talking about the homonationalism bit.
Okay.
So, for the listener that has never encountered the term, homonationalism is a term coined by Jasbir Puar in her 2007 work, Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times, which is what Sam Aburime refers to.
Mm-hmm.
So, I will forewarn the listener that we will not be talking about homonationalism or Jasbir Puar or anything like that in great detail today. One, because Talia and I are ourselves greatly interested in reading this book and making it its own episode.
Mm-hmm. Foreshadowing.
Right. But two, we will not be talking about homonationalism in depth because neither does Sam Aburime. The quotation that is used in the paper is limited to 4 words, one of which is and. And let me set the scene for you. So it is actually kind of at the end of the paper. The majority of the paper is spent talking about transphobia and misogyny and stuff like that.
Mhm.
This is sort of the brackets. It's talked about the anti-Asian prejudice and homonationalism are talked about in the introduction and like towards the end of the paper. So it kind of bookends it.
Mhm.
And so at the end of the paper, Aburime cites homonationalism and describes it as a phenomenon that encompasses the unique queer national exceptionalism present in Western, white majority English-speaking nations, which acts as a regulatory script, quote, for gayness, queerness, and homosexuality, end quote.
For our listeners, I'm currently looking at a highlighted screen share of this section of the paper. So again, as Emma said, the part where Jasbir Puar's work is quoted is simply 4 words: gayness, queerness, and homosexuality. So I'm going to assume that Puar provides a definition of her own, a larger definition, but like even that
Right.
larger definition has not been quoted. It's simply gayness, queerness, and homosexuality has been lifted from that book and has a citation next to.
Right.
I
so
don't.
if you're familiar with Puar's work at all, Puar's is hugely concerned with terrorism and quote-unquote counterterrorism of U.S., in for instance, Muslim countries, which is a concept completely absent from this paper. We're talking about BL fandom at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the definitions provided by Puar or the commentary are irrelevant to it, but there is no attempt to present the relevance.
It hasn't been incorporated well. Like this is just taking this is just taking a razor thin snapshot and like slipping it into the end of this paper for
Right.
what really seems to me to be just the appearance of like legitimacy. Quite frankly.
In the beginning, the way this is built up is Aburime provides an example of some kind of poor treatment of either a Japanese fandom or a Japanese creator, links to a Tumblr post which slings slurs at them or something. Right, like that level of behavior, and is like, see, people are racist sometimes. from which Aburime takes that Western fandoms attempt to paint BL as morally impure. That may or may not be correct, but they do no work to actually showcase that, or besides a singular Tumblr screenshot, and then therefore homonationalism.
May, at this point, I gotta just say what we're all thinking. This is less rigorous academia and the structuring, and more the structuring of a call-out post.
Yes,
It
is.
absolutely 1000% reads it like a call-out post. Wait, if you look at the title of this episode, we have racism, transphobia, anti-BL stuff. Well, murder, arson, jaywalking, but also massive topics, and linking a fandom phenomenon to either transphobia or racism is a whole multiple papers of their own. But this is all one thing. As this is all one 20-page paper.
This strategy of argumentation, I would call it vibes building, where basically what we're doing is saying, let's kind of gesture at things that remind you of something and kind of give you the taste of a vibe. And we say, look at how these vibes are coming together. And it just gives you like a feeling about it of it must be something like this, And I think that can actually be effective communication. You're trying to get the audience to feel something, not just to have a logical conclusion. When you're attaching it to a conclusion, it it doesn't mean the conclusion that you arrive at is correct or that it's supported. And canny audience members will see that.
Because look, we all know that like bigotries are often co-occurring, right? Like, if you look at someone who is a racist, it's not going to be the biggest shock in the world if they also turn out to be sexist, That's almost a gimme. But like
Right.
there's a very strong like guilt by association vibe over here, which is that we have named a thing, we have named racism, we have named transphobia, these cardinal sins, and then we have turned to the camera and said, have you noticed how often people who have a problem with BL, or not even necessarily have a problem with BL, who have any critiques of either BL media or BL fandom at all. We're painting with a very broad brush here. Have you noticed how those people are racist and transphobic? And the question over there is, are they? Are they in significant amounts? And you would think that this paper would make the case, but I have a feeling Emma is going to tell me that it doesn't quite get there.
No, so the argument that I have described to you, statement made, Tumblr screenshot confirming it, then building the ante of creating more emotion around it, more outrage, and citing something more respectable than a Tumblr screenshot that is related to the vibes, the emotional ante, like here homonationalism, which doesn't talk about BL or fandom or anything, but the vibes have been built and it's related to the vibes, therefore we cite it to appear, for the argument to appear more legit. And now we hope that the reader is convinced enough that we have made this argument compelling enough to agree with the conclusion. And that's kind of it.
I don't know what more you want from Sam Aburime. Look, Jasper Puar, in her book, said the words gayness, queerness, and homosexuality. Obviously, this text is vital to understanding any critique of BL culture that has ever been made. Obviously.
Right, and the other thing that I want to draw your attention to that is in the document that I'm showing you, not highlighted, but it's a little switcheroo that you will notice several times that is very important to understanding this paper.
Okay.
So, immediately after the highlighted section, right, Sam Aburime says, Western anti-BL critics position BL media, fujoshi, and fudanshi, which is to say female and male fans of BL, as their, quote, racialized others.
What?
Quote, who are backsliding and thus need guidance in terms of proper LGBTQ representation. And then they cite Fujoshi Info website, which I will remind the listener is a collection of screenshots.
Wait, hold on.
So, May, Talia, how do you feel about fans of BL being described as racialized others?
All right, I'm gonna have to take this. I'm gonna have to take this one first, May, for perhaps obvious reasons.
Please do.
Okay.
Please do.
Okay.
Interested in listening.
So, a lot of the people who I know who have espoused critiques of BL media, of Fujoshi, Fudanshi, of that entire fandom culture, A lot of those people are Asian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Asian. Like, in the West is a culture that is dominated by non-racialized, aka white people, just due to the nature of the demographics of the West and the demographics of the West-dominated internet. I understand why you were calling this a switcheroo now. It is really a hell of a. The sleight of hand is really straining at the cards over here. Just to be like, yeah, actually, white people who consume are treated as racialized others, even by Asian people who think they're being weird.
but okay. So Aburime says here very clearly, Talia, that it's about Western anti-BL critics, and although you and I are both Western when people are mad enough at us,
Right.
we are technically neither of us Western. So May, what is your opinion as the resident and the only Western person here? Right.
Well,
So what is your opinion on Fujoshi and Fudanshi being inherently racialized?
yeah, well, so I have several thoughts on that. And, like, first of all, it's just pretty obvious kind of deck stacking in the argument because it's oversimplifying the playing field, right? Like, that's really obvious. But it's funny, when Talia started talking, what I was thinking was it's just a humorous irony that she's an Asian woman who's presumably not interested in boys' love or that kind of fiction at all, whereas
Nope.
I am. Like, I'm kind of the Fujoshi voice on this episode, so to speak, and I'm white and American. And while I definitely have experiences with, I guess we could say stigma or homophobia that deal with my consumption of that media, perhaps, it certainly is not racialized. I mean, if we're just going to kind of compile vibes from people's anecdotes, my anecdotes would not support that conclusion.
May, this is the critical question this paper is asking of you. Do you consider yourself racialization affected?
Oh my god, you can't just ask me that. No, well, of course not. At least not for this. Certainly not for this. But there certainly is like a kind of a anti-Asian flavor to the way some people in the West, in the United States, for example, react to Japanese media. I've encountered a lot of that from family and people around me where there's dunking on anime and manga and things like that. But I'm just a little astounded at the ambition of this argument, considering how little there is supplied to support it. I mean, it's
Because, like, we can talk about that, right? Because we can actually talk about the fact that, like, I have seen in these discursive spaces, I have seen Westerners champion their own shows, like, and, like, position Western media output as, in some sense, innately superior to the quote-unquote problematic media that is coming out of Japan. And there are a lot of arguments deployed to make that comparison, right?
yeah.
Why is Japanese media considered inherently problematic? Why is it considered inherently more sexualized? Why is it considered inherently more suspect in terms of, like, I have seen the criticism levied against Japanese media that it is in some senses colorist and racist, and those can be valid and legitimate arguments when we're discussing perhaps specific pieces of media or specific genre, but to paint all of the cultural output with this broad brush, especially in defense of Western media, that is a real and an extant problem. However, that is not really the argument that Aburime has presented here, and certainly not with the requisite level of, like, nuance and consideration, because this is simply a bald-faced attempt to position pretty much every Western consumer of BL as, like, inherently a victim of anyone who might have anything negative or critical to say about BL media. It is an attempted construction. It is an attempted construction of a power imbalance while gesturing at existing power dynamics in society and in social spaces.
Right, so here's the thing. That's kind of what I was trying to get at with exemplifying the way Aburime talks about homonationalism, is that it's not even really a question of like, have they noticed a real tendency that exists? Because noticing racism is pretty trivial. And they actually provide an example that could be pretty decent in, like, a an essay, for instance, such as they specifically cite Heartstopper, which, for
Mhm.
the unaware, is a popular YA gay romance from the West that has been compared to BL media, and there has been a certain amount of derangement about comparing it to BL media.
Mhm.
And in particular, Aburime cites here how some people, again, it is proven by Tumblr screenshots or Twitter citations, some people were very incensed to have their precious baby pure YA romance compared to such terrible things as yaoi.
Mhm.
So, like, there is something to it. The issue is that, one, this is an academic paper, and two, the argumentation ends with Tumblr screenshots. And the thing is that, as an essayist, like, even if I imagined this written as an essay and not as a paper, which, one, if it were an essay, it would have had way too many fucking citations and it would have looked as if it's trying to club you over the head with them. But two, when you're writing an essay, you are given a greater sort of leeway of subjectivity and at the same time less legitimacy, because you are essentially constructing a theory of something based on your experiences, but it is put to you to be persuasive and to convince the reader that what you see, the tendencies and the connections that you see exist, and it takes more than a singular Tumblr screenshot to do that.
Yeah, because look, the bottom line over here is that like if the standard of evidence for demonstrating a trend is a single Tumblr screenshot, we can find singular Tumblr screenshots or singular tweets alleging a great many things. Like you said earlier, you know, we can prove that I don't know, fandom thinks the Earth is flat. If all I have to do is find a single flat earther who has ever expressed an opinion about fandom, you know,
Exactly.
this is something we can do. But like, yeah, I feel like the burden of proof needs to be higher, and you know, if the burden of proof cannot be met, at the very least, this should be framed and parsed as personal testimony. And personal testimony can be powerful, and personal testimony can be persuasive. But from what I've seen, I don't really believe this paper to be either of those things.
Right, so let us move on now to the actual claims that this,
Oh my god,
besides gesturing at some people being racist and painting then the Fujoshi as being inherently racialized,
Oh
let's
my
move on to the
gosh.
actual claims that is this paper tries to make.
this was just the attempt. This was just the attempt to like legitimize the arguments. We haven't even gotten to the arguments yet. Beautiful.
Oh my gosh.
No, well, okay, so technically these are parts of the arguments, as the title claims, and I will again point out that this paper in very few 20 pages, less than that, because some of those are references,
Mhm.
is straddling anti-BL, racism, and transphobia, which is a lot. So, having read the paper, I get a very distinct sense that arguments about racism and discussions of racism were extremely shallow and pretty much conclude where I have described them.
Oh
But it
goody.
was actually a lot more interested in arguing the transphobia part, and that is the
All right.
majority of this paper and its central part.
All right. You ready for this, May?
Yes, this part will be fun. This will be the fun part, I
Right, again, for
think.
the purposes of listeners that may or may not be aware of who we are, well, you're aware of who I am, but both Talia and May are trans women.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I am not real and not valid, but I did live for a decade as a trans man, so I feel like I have a degree of epistemic authority on the treatment of trans men.
Unfortunately, you are cis now, and we're gonna have to caveat everything you say with that.
Yes, I am worse than cis,
Talia and
frankly.
I composing our call out notes for you that's going to follow this episode.
Yeah, yeah, that's gonna be the Patreon bonus episode. It's gonna be a solid hour of May and me just calling out Emma for how problematic she has been throughout this entire episode. But anyway.
Argument number 1, she is cis now. God.
Oh, believe it or not, my experience as D-trans is hilariously relevant to this paper. But we'll get to that. So, once we're done with the bookends of, I guess, racism, um, we move on to
Okay.
discussing the misogynistic elements of criticizing Fujoshi, which, again, for the unaware, I will remind that Fujoshi is a Japanese word that is usually used to refer to female fans of BL, yaoi, and associated media.
Mm-hmm.
Here, Aburime makes the argument that anti-BL prejudice, and specifically anti-Fujoshi prejudice, because, and this is one, not necessarily a well-supported argument, but it is an accurate one, that most people, when they think of fans of BL, especially Asian BL, they think of women. And Aburime observes that the popular perception is that most fans of BL are cisgender heterosexual women, and that criticisms of BL take on a particular misogynistic turn, wherein those women are painted as perverts, basically, and points specifically to the etymology of the word fujoshi, which is not particularly kind to those women. So the claim they make in this section where they talk about misogyny, which is relatively short, it's a bit more than one page, and supported by Tumblr screenshots, is basically most people believe that fans of BL are cis heterosexual women. However, it is not true. They cite a work by someone else that says that there is a recognized contingent of queer women that are fans of BL, and that some people that are in the BL fandom are trans men. Now, remember when I mentioned that there are opportunities in this paper for providing numerical data?
Yeah.
This is one of them, because from my cursory knowledge of Aburime before now, I know that they used to be pretty well established and well known within active online Fujo fandoms. So BL fandoms, right? So I imagine it would have been pretty trivial to create a anonymous Google form where you could have ticked your identity or put in your own or something. And although obviously we could then talk about sampling bias, this and that, the other thing, how to group people correctly, la la la. But nevertheless, it could have been very easy to make an attempt to actually provide numerical data as to the distribution of gender or sexuality within the BL fandom. And no such thing has been done here. And I will, spoilers, but the demographics of BL fandoms are critical to the argument that this paper makes.
Oh boy. All right. I feel like over here, before I say anything, I think I might have to defer to May over here. And so May, I'll just ask it. So neither of us has ever conducted surveys on this, but May, if I were to ask, do you think that the majority of BL fandom is non-cisgender or like, queer? Would that reflect your experience in these spaces?
I think it's kind of a math problem, right? Because the first thing we kind of need to address is, the availability heuristics, where I could say from personal experience that I know a lot of trans, non-binary, queer, gay, bisexual, etc. people who consume this kind of media. I can even say the majority of people that I know personally who do are something like that. But even with that, I don't actually know that that's true, but I'm just trying to think of people I know through kind of the author space. But even if it were, just from a mathematics perspective, I would be extremely skeptical of that claim because you know that the sales numbers on media like this just couldn't be small enough to primarily be of populations that are like 8%, 8 to 10%.
We're fundamentally talking about a commercially viable genre, right? And
Exactly,
if you're
right.
if you're talking about a commercially viable genre, then I wouldn't quite call it with mainstream appeal. That part is fair, but like it is not nearly niche enough to just be like indie lesbian self-publishing space, to name a completely
Right.
random example. Um, it is totally possible that these fandom spaces, that these creators are disproportionately queer. Will they ever shake out as being majority queer, especially when it comes to consumers of the genre? It's
Mm-hmm.
highly, highly unlikely. Like even
Right.
just based on what I know of like the publishing space, which again is not quite the exact same milieu as like what we're talking about, but the publishing space is increasingly informed by trends and by social dynamics within the fandom spaces and within specifically BL fandom spaces. And like
Right.
there is a reason MM has a certain commercial viability that FF simply does not.
I think so. You mentioned how like the Western novel kind of market and there's not a one-to-one, comparison between them. There is, however, a lot of overlap, and some of the overlaps I think are easy enough to generalize across the board. And this is something we'll probably have to come back to, but there's an important point in here, something that has always made me uncomfortable with this argument, that it's not all or even mostly cis straight women who consume or like this media. I think we are really overlooking how much of the merit, or let's just be really generous toward the media for a second, whether we're talking about the Western kind or the Japanese kind or the Korean kind or not. A big part of the appeal is that there is a kind of emotional link between the queer minority that the story's being written about and the cis straight girls and women who are identifying with them. And that's actually a really important part of the appeal for me personally. And so as a trans creator myself, that's something I always have to think about is I have to find, we could say all day that there's a certain artistic value or personal value or even political value to writing for the trans audience and even putting the trans audience first. But finding an in for the cis audience and finding the bridge with the cis audience is something I've just always got to think about. And everyone who is dealing with this kind of media, queer media of any kind, whether we're saying trans or not, the connection to the cis heterosexual audience is always part of the equation. You can't escape it.
Amazing point.
Yeah, and you honestly think that's kind of part of the joy of it when there is joy coming from it, is the fact that there is this thing in common. And so I've always been suspicious of the inclination to kind of back away from that and say, well, really this is kind of queer people playing with queer imagery and cishet people might kind of jump on, but it's not primarily about them. Well, I guess we could argue what primarily means, but it is for sure about them because we're kind of trying to communicate with them with this sort of media to start with.
This is particularly true of romance, or even media that features romance prominently, which BL obviously is. It is definitionally about romance and or erotica. Whether it is correct or not, prudent or not, morally correct or not, publishing presumes that the majority of readers of romance and erotica are cisgender heterosexual women. And marketing works accordingly. And they are numerically a bigger demographic than queer readers, all of them total. Especially accounting for the fact that not everyone queer on the planet wants to read romance, let alone this one specifically.
Yep.
So it's not even talking about creators or their intentions, but rather that the market will self-select and edit books in order to at least partially appeal to what it believes to be the main demographic.
Yeah, in the face of all of those publishing realities that we have all had to contend with as authors, I think it feels a bit ridiculous to pretend that this is a queer-dominated commercial space. I highly doubt that you can make the case for that.
The argument that the misogyny segment essentially makes is that, and again, I will use hyperbolic language because that is how the paper is, but again, there is no numerical survey or first-hand testimony supporting evidence to any of this. So the argument it makes is everyone who dislikes or feels antipathy towards BL is under the impression that the consumers of BL are cis heterosexual women who are not allies to gay men, do not care about gay men, and merely fetishize them. And the paper then claims that this criticism is incorrect because some women are queer, and that this argument itself is misogynistic. That is more or less the end of the misogyny argument.
So we're seeing actually the same rhetorical device reapplied over here. Then this is kind of an adjacency thing. Like, the very presence of, like, queer people or queer women within this fandom instantly renders all criticisms of it innately misogynistic or transphobic or queerphobic, as the case may be. It's not a very rigorous or compelling argument.
No, I do want to point out that, again, whenever I talk about the rigor in this paper, it is, this is a condemnation of the approach itself even. It is not even me commenting on what this paper is claiming, because there exists a phenomenon of criticizing media merely for having predominantly female fandoms. Like, completely unrelated to this, a very good example of Twilight. Is Twilight shit written by a Mormon? Yes,
Yeah.
But most people do not criticize it for the racism or the Mormonism of it. They criticize it because it's cringe because the girls like it. And that is a very existing phenomenon. It's almost like the society we live in is misogynistic, and every time it does anything, it can't stop producing misogyny. It's almost like that happens sometimes.
That might be an interesting topic for a paper, even.
Yeah, it would be. It would have been, wouldn't it? It would have been nice if someone wrote a paper about it. Unfortunately, no one did. Certainly not Aburime. So, like, here's the thing: would it be misogynistic to say that this fucking gay slop from Japan, only women's like it and women are cringe? Like, would that be misogynistic? Yes. Has someone
Absolutely.
said it? Almost
Probably,
certainly
yeah.
someone has said it. Yeah. Yeah, I don't even need to look it up. I don't need a Tumblr screenshot. I can I can simply guess based on my lived experiences. But here is the thing: from this, it does not follow that criticism of BL or dislike of BL fans and their culture is inherently misogynistic. There has no compelling argument, let alone evidence, has been provided to anything of the sort.
Yeah, look, I feel very safe just like saying it now at this juncture in the episode and in the paper. This entire thing is an exercise in frankly, an anti-intellectualism. Because what is ultimately
Yes.
being alleged over here, we're not actually talking about racism with any degree of rigor or interest. We have not talked about misogyny with any degree of rigor or interest, and we haven't quite covered the transphobia yet, but like when we get there,
Mm-hmm.
I get the feeling that we're not going to be talking about the transphobia with any degree of rigor or interest either. What this paper is actually interested in doing, and not that rigorously, is fundamentally positioning all critique of a particular genre of media as invalid and inherently bigoted, simply by making arguments through proximity, at best.
Right. And like, here's the thing: it's kind of, and I have noticed this like about halfway through the paper, if not earlier, that it's not so much making an argument as it's constructing the most morally defensible position. It does this with racism, it does this with misogyny. It points towards adjacent and relevant axes of marginalization, points towards the existence of people affected by them, and ipso facto, the fujos are basically the same as racialized fujos.
Oh no.
You know, therefore, and it is like we will get to be insulted by this more in the transphobia section, to which we will be coming shortly. But it is a little bit insulting to see racism, including just screenshots or like references to screenshots of racist abuse or misogynistic abuse, to be used
Mhm.
this way to construct a morally infallible armor for all of BL fandom.
Yeah, it's basically saying if we have any critiques of BL media, or not even critiques, if we like frankly discuss some aspects in which BL media could be improved or some issues that we have noticed in BL media, this paper is basically pointing at us and saying, look, you sound like this deranged Tumblr racist over here.
Mhm.
And to be frank, I don't. I don't. I've heard myself talk. I
Right.
do not sound like a deranged Tumblr racist.
Right. It seems like so far the general strategy of this paper is rhetorical, not logical. So we're
Absolutely.
like
Mm-hmm.
relying on imagery and the optics basically of the claim. So it's all peripheral rather than, as been pointed out multiple times, there's not really evidence, but there's a lot of gesturing in the periphery and kind of massaging the audience to say, doesn't that feel bad to you?
Yeah, I feel completely safe saying this now, by the way, but like let's just say let's even give Sam Aburime the win here, okay? Let's say, all right, you know what? Fine. Let's say like 70% of people who consume this media are like, queer or closeted, sure. That still doesn't mean that this is a genre that is like beyond
Mhm.
critique. Like if we want to talk about FF, a space that is largely dominated by queer women, I don't know how to tell you all this, but I have made critiques of FF media, of FF as a
Mhm.
genre, of like trends within FF media, as have a lot of my friends who are lesbians, and some who
Right.
aren't. Like the question of the demographics of a particular fandom space are perhaps relevant when we are trying to like evaluate arguments against that piece of media. Like, sometimes it is possible to spot, as in the case of like the misogynistic Twilight critic who does not actually touch upon any of the actual problems of Twilight. It is possible to glean when like the bigotry is more important than the actual arguments being made. That does
Right.
not mean that like every single argument comes from a place of bigotry, or that arguments in general can be entirely dismissed out of hand as bigotry. And this feels obvious to say, but part of the reason it's so frustrating and needs to be said is because this is the kind of like liberal argumentation from identity politics that has dominated social media, not just Tumblr,
Mm-hmm.
has absolutely dominated social media, especially bases that like style themselves or consider themselves more progressive for the past like at least a decade, you know, at least since the advent and subsequent decline of the feminist blogosphere. It's simply not a good line of argumentation.
Right. I can speak a little bit to that there because even though, I certainly don't have some kind of omniscient perspective on social media, but I've been using it in kind of the capacity I use it as a, marginalized creator, as a trans writer of fiction and nonfiction, so on, for over 10 years. And I've actually seen shifts in kind of what seem to be trends in acceptable argumentation, like what is treated as justification for, XYZ. And that, like, I actually watched this kind of shift out of feminist perspectives being treated with some kind of validity to this really, really intense, obvious anti-feminism being kind of omnipresent. And so I don't want to repeat like Aburime's move here and say, oh, I can point to things I've seen and homogenize it all. But there's definitely an atmosphere of anti-feminism that has intensified pretty steadily that entire time. And that's been across different platforms and with very different audiences. So saying this is dominated that environment for 10 years, like, I can say yes, absolutely, I've watched it happen.
Yeah, and the thing that I've also observed, and you'll probably be able to confirm this, May, is that at the same time as the shift happened towards anti-feminism, I've observed sort of appeals to idpol, basically, identity
Mm-hmm.
politics, to become prevalent. As
Right.
as in general, not just anti-feminism proliferated, but anti-intellectualism is in general. So arguments towards like theory and anything that is might be seen as highfalutin have sort of decreased in rhetorical value, but appeals to I know better because have exponentially increased in value. And now, naturally, there is obviously you can argue for greater authority on the subject if you have experience with it and it affects you directly. But what this does is when there is anti-intellectualism, an appeal against theory and for itpol, and arguments from authority, what happens, one, is people do not meet the other people with authority on the same epistemological level. They don't try to understand their arguments.
Mm-hmm.
They just accept them because they are right to say them and I'm not. So they don't actually understand what it is they're agreeing with. They simply agree because in their sorting algorithm of who has the right to talk about what, this person has slotted correctly. And
Right.
two, is this creates incentive to write things like this that we're seeing right now in front of us by Aburime, where in order to argue something, instead of presenting an argument, they're merely gesturing towards someone else's or their own, who the fuck knows, marginalization
Right.
and sort of sweeping the whole group towards it by proxy to give it epistemic authority via identity. Whether or not it possesses that identity or not, whether or not it possesses that authority, it becomes, in this discursive space, critical to acquire authority. And since authority is only acquired by declaration of identity, then the entire group must be given this identity in order to be able to speak for itself.
Yup.
That
Yep.
is
Yep. Yep.
that's
Yep.
a really good observation. So what I would call that is the substitution of standpoint epistemology for intellectual rigor. And so instead of believing that arguments can have merit and we can demonstrate the merit through evidence, we say arguments don't have merit, viewpoints have merit based on the standpoint, the epistemological standpoint. And then it becomes a race to see who has the more authoritative standpoint. And like this
Yep,
has just become so
basically.
entrenched in the social media milieu. And I would almost say, especially among like environments dominated or with a high prevalence of marginalized creators and, whether it's fiction or not. But it's kind of like basically saying the intellect or the interest in having like evidence-based arguments is a primarily white male cis etc western interest. And so in order to combat white male cis western interests or dominance, we have to abandon all the tools that we associate with it.
I want to thank Emma first and foremost for using the words epistemic authority before I did. Thank you. It
Mwah.
helps. It helps a little bit in like
It's a good phrase.
it is, and it helps a little bit in like not turning that into my catchphrase. But now that you broke the seal, yeah, I really gotta point out that the style of argumentation fundamentally it is an abuse of the concept of epistemic authority. Like
Mm-hmm.
it is simultaneously true that like specific voices are devalued, that specific voices based on identity, specific voices from specific demographics are pushed out of like discursive spaces of like the conversation about a variety of topics. At the same time, that does not mean that the way to redress this is to go out and hunt for someone with like an appropriate level of epistemic authority, according to you, who shares all of your opinions, or even as Emma pointed out, to look for someone whose opinions on a topic you don't understand, but you just nod along with because you're like, oh, they have more epistemic authority on this than I do. That is,
Mm-hmm.
again, it is more anti-intellectualism. It is a bad way to actually engage with these topics. It is a shortcut that people take specifically because it is easier than actually engaging with
Mm-hmm.
the topics and forming your own opinion on them based on like synthesizing views that others have provided you. And this is something
Right.
that I run into. This is a problem I run into a lot as like a rather marginalized creator. There are not a lot of other
Mhm.
writers out there who are talking about the things that I talk about and who are also like brown, trans, immigrant lesbians from the third world.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a wide pool. And like, perhaps that gives me a certain level of undue epistemic authority, and I try to be cognizant of that as much as possible, but I fundamentally do not want people to simply reiterate the things I am saying because I said them. This is why I try to present actual convincing arguments in whatever form I feel that takes, so that people can actually connect, can actually relate it to their own experiences, even if they don't entirely line up with mine. Because that's actually what trying to argue from positions of from like specific epistemic positionalities is. Try to understand and not simply just pick it up and
Right.
incorporate it into your worldview without understanding.
Right.
Right, and it creates two problems, right? One is that you have not accomplished very much in terms of seeing marginalized people as equal to you because you do not accept them as intellectual equals.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't listening to what they're saying. You don't examine what they're saying. You don't try to internalize it. You simply agree blindly. And then that leads to the second problem, which I can demonstrate by example. Okay, let's listen to trans men. Here are two trans men. Here is Derek and here is Josh. Derek is a genderfuck, gender fluid trans man that thinks everyone should be able to transition and gender isn't real. Josh thinks that he'll never be a real man because he doesn't have a penis and is firmly in support of Dr. Gatekeeping. Which trans men should you listen to? According to
Oof.
this perspective, to both at the same time. But what
Yeah.
practically ends up happening is because people don't actually do anything to combat the epistemic aspect of marginalization, which is that they are encouraged at every level of society and taught to not listen to marginalized people in a very literal sense, not even recognize their perspectives. What they actually do upon encountering two opposing, incompatible perspectives from the same marginalized group, they pick the one they like better. They pick the one that affirms their worldview better and simply construct, however strenuous, an argument that the other person, the ones that they don't want to agree with, is somehow not really from this group, or shouldn't actually speak, or is maybe more privileged than they realize, or whatever. So they undermine their epistemic authority rather than actually try to think about the two perspectives presented and weigh them against each other.
What a crazy topic of conversation that I don't have extensive personal experience with anyway.
I know, right?
Like that's the problem fundamentally, right? We talked about earlier how about like if the bar is low, you can find anyone saying anything. Well, fundamentally, you are going to be able to find marginalized perspectives. You're going to be able to find marginalized voices that reinforce the hegemonic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to be able to
Yep.
find that, especially when that kind of thing is incentivized, and we've
Mm-hmm.
seen that kind of thing be incentivized, and that ends up being a huge problem because again, if the bar for evidence is that low, I need to produce a single Tumblr, or I need to produce a single person with the requisite epistemic authority to weigh in on this topic. And oh look, what do you know? What do you know? They're saying the exact same thing that the majority does.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, this is not a good baseline for like argumentation, for like knowledge building, for anything, for understanding the plight of the marginalized. And it all fundamentally rests on this incredibly poorly formed strategy where identity is allowed to be a stand-in for authority, which like it's simply untenable if you want a productive and healthy discourse.
Right.
Yeah, so with that in mind, that is a fantastic foundation for discussing the next section. Everyone say goodbye to queer women. We will never talk about them again in this paper.
And now we finally get to the bloody transphobia. Lovely.
Yes, yes, of course. So, I'm going to now recount to you the general argument presented by Aburime here in regards to quote their subtitle, Gender Criticals and the Propagation of Anti-BL and Anti-Fujoshi Sentiments. So, Aburime makes the claim that anti-BL sentiment, which, I will just point out, just as an aside, that Aburime never, defines it or, distinguishes anti-BL or anti-Fujoshi stuff in any way. So, as you may have noticed, they talk about critique, criticism, harassment, deranged racism posting all in the same stroke, and, in a very literal sense, they never define what it is they're talking about.
There's so much murder, arson, jaywalking throughout this entire episode, I swear.
There really is. So the central argument that Aburime is making is that some turfs have conducted psyops and other activities to spread anti-BL rhetoric. This rhetoric has mostly concerned gay trans men, and they sort of ipso facto, therefore, make the claim that anti-Fujoshi sentiment and anti-BL sentiment is transphobic, and specifically anti-transmasculine in nature. They don't use the word anti-transmasculinity or anything like that, but they only talk about trans men. So, again, when trying to make this argument, they mostly cite Tumblr screenshots of TERFs, or they cite Fujoshi info, which in turn cites TERFs talking about gay trans men or talking about Fujoshi stuff and stuff like that. So again, there is no sense of scope here. Aburime, again, as always, never gives any kind of sense of scope of argument, how prevalent it is, how often does it occur, and it's impossible to have it because the only proof is a Tumblr post, or 2 Tumblr posts, or 3, or a collection of 10 from Fujoshi info. So it's kind of impossible to say. So the central argument for why anti-BL stuff is transphobic is because some TERFs have written on the internet that trans men that were or are in the BL fandom are sex-crazed straight women that have consumed too much gay porn and now believe they can turn into these fey, beautiful, dainty gay little boys by taking testosterone and come out as trans men. Now, so I am a D-trans lesbian, which is a
Evil and
fantastic
problematic,
point of
yes.
epistemic evil and problematic. It's a fantastic point to talk about this. But one, I will point out, so Aburime makes this claim that this kind of rhetoric is incredibly prevalent and is a point of attack against trans men. I will point out that in terms of scope and oxygen spent and the prominence of argumentation, I am the GC argument against trans men. Me, it is me. I am the cudgel. It's not that I particularly enjoy the position, but the most common argument again that GCs deploy to create sort of to argue that trans men are basically not real and should not transition, blah blah blah, is that all trans men are misled lesbians that are self-harming themselves because patriarchy or whatever the fuck,
Mm.
or that they believe that they can escape the pains of womanhood and become men, but oh no, they never can and they will be forever damaged. Blah, 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 blah. So I feel really left out to never even be mentioned here, to be
Aw.
honest.
Emma, as a cis woman, I don't think you can be saying these things.
Oh, well, cancel me, mommy.
Oh.
Anyway. So this is my little corner of grievance with this paper. They forgot about me.
So this unfortunately brings the conversation more directly into my wheelhouse, which so in the interest of being fair, I'm going to preface this by saying, yes, once again I understand that this is a discursive space where it is hard to get hard numbers, okay? You can't exactly poll turfs and ask them, so what specific psychosexual derangements motivate you, you know?
Mhm.
They do mostly operate anonymously via sock puppets. They do coordinate campaigns in social spaces and things like that. All of that is true. However, this is going to start becoming a mantra for me, but like bathrooms, prisons, sports. Okay? Like,
Yep.
if you actually look at the texture of mainstream transphobia, it is by and large transmisogyny, and even more than that, it is by and large trans lesbophobia. The gay trans man has had some attempts to sort of frame his position in these discourses as somewhat analogous to the trans lesbian, but the trans lesbian has a history going all the way back to 1979. For those who don't know, that was before Tumblr existed, in which the existence of the trans lesbian itself was called a form of rape. Like not that trans lesbians are a rapacious threat to women, although that is something that was argued in the text that I'm referring to, Janice Raymond's Transsexual Empire. But it was fundamentally argued that the very existence that our own bodies, the body of the transsexual lesbian, is itself a rape against womankind, a rape against the purity of the category woman. That is the fundamental level of derangement that we're dealing with here.
Right.
That there really is not a commensurate, there's not an equal and opposite outrage for the idea of porn mad straight woman who transitions to prey on gay men. Primarily because, a lot of the transphobic derangement is around the purity of the category woman and is largely focused around framing women, cis women, as victims of trans women.
As much as I kind of joke that I am the most common counter argument against trans men by GCs or whatever, I will be remiss not to note that a lot of the obsession with detrans women is about the loss of fertility, right? And this through line runs regardless of the trans masculine or detrans person's sexuality, because that is the derangement about women, the capacity to be reproductively exploited, right? So everyone who is born supposedly with the capacity to bear children must do so, and we must force them to do it. And like, to be clear, framing gay trans men as like just these stupid straight women that just fetishize gay men and want to get gay men to sleep to them is a thing that exists. It exists especially within gay male spaces, hilariously. The paper doesn't talk about this, but it's true. Having been in them, I can confirm that it's true. But it simply does not reach the rhetorical apotheosis.
Mm-hmm. It's not a focus of the GC propaganda, and this is actually my biggest issue with Aburime, even despite everything else. I mean, the Fujoshi is inherent, the Western Fujoshi is inherently racialized, is a hell of a thing to say, but like this is my biggest issue with Aburime is that they position themselves as an authority on GC issues while having fundamentally no idea of how GC spaces operate, how GC rhetoric operates, or even paying attention to the actual rhetoric that is constantly regurgitated in the news media, positioning the trans lesbian as the threat, the ultimate threat to women and to womanhood. Like, yes, there are turfs in fandom who have tried to make an analogous argument for gay trans men. Absolutely, but the prominence, the pervasiveness is simply not on the same level. And this is the point I really want to drive home. A lot of the times when the GC is talking about things like irreversible damage or loss of fertility or the way that a cis woman, a putatively cis woman transitioning is self-mutilation, a lot of the time those trans masculine transitioners are positioned as victims of transgender ideology as perpetuated by quote unquote perverse trans women. So that is the rhetorical structure at play. We are reduced to our sex, to our assumed immutable, quote unquote, natural sex, and then the trans femme is positioned ontologically male and aggressor, while the trans masc is positioned as ontologically female, victim. So it doesn't really have the same bite if they try it. It doesn't have the same cachet. For GC propaganda to work, the trans masc must be regendered, and the trans femme must be degendered and brutified and bestialized.
Right, and I will also say that, as I have pointed to, a little bit of a moment of like arson and jaywalking here is that I would draw your attention to the example I cited, that the idea that the gay trans man, or the trans man that is attracted to men, is just a porn sick woman trying to prey on gay men and seduce them to sleep with him.
Mm-hmm.
I cited that from like gay male spaces that have never heard or very much cared about yaoi. So Aburime makes this kind of switcheroo where anti-BL stuff is inherently transphobic because transphobes have said so in fandom, but kind of failing to notice that they have been calling gay trans men stupid, misguided heterosexual women so many different ways. They don't need help. That the context of fandom exists. It's just kind of there, isn't it? I know of gay trans men that have had this kind of accusations, including being accused of being fujos, funnily enough, despite having never been in fandom. There is not a two-way causal link, simply. Two switcheroos are made here. One I will highlight right now for you. So, to gender criticals, transgender identities are the result of fetishes, paraphilias, and mental defects. Citation Blanchard, 1991. Now, this citation points to Blanchard Ray, 1991, Clinical Observations and Systematic Studies of Autogynephilia. For the blissfully unaware, autogynephilia refers to a kooky anti-scientific theory about trans lesbian women. So you will know that it has nothing at all to do with trans men, but Aburime presents it as if it concerns all trans people, which it clearly does not. So the switcheroo number one is that they take something that applies predominantly to trans women, and they reference a source that talks about trans women, but they frame it as just a trans thing in general, and they never themselves really talk about trans women at all, and only about trans men, and specifically gay trans men, but they kind of forget that the other ones exist. And then switcheroo number two, that is one is my favorite personally. So this is after commenting about the way GCs talk about gay trans men. Quote, gender criticals refer to trans men, open brackets, and by extension fujoshi, close brackets, as homophobic due to their belief that trans men are heterosexual women forcing their way into authentic, i.e. cisgender, gay male spaces. Citation of the Fujoshi Info website. So, you have observed the switcheroo for the second time. Before, we have noted how all Fujoshi are racialized. Now, all Fujoshi are masculinized into being trans men, including the hapless lesbians that were mentioned a few pages ago. As a D-trans lesbian, I don't approve, but But anyway, so you see what I mean when I say that this paper simply attempts to make the most morally defensible argument, kind of like construct the most marginalizations that it considers to be morally defensible, and just kind of.
Right.
If you are a Fujoshi, you are ontologically a racialized gay trans man.
I mean, that's forced transitioning me, okay, into a trans man. I just.
Yeah, I was about to say, May Peterson. As a racialized trans man, what are your feelings about this?
Yeah, would you like to give us your epistemically informed perspective on this, darling?
So this is a pretty big topic, right? But I do want to preface by saying I am a sex-obsessed straight woman who has consumed way too much gay porn. And I also have invaded cis gay male spaces my entire life by being in them. But
we love a girl boss. We love to see women winning. We support women's rights.
More seriously, this is kind of one of my lines with this kind of media is I have a long history with and have a great deal of affection for media that is, like BL is an example of it. It's not the only kind. And there are kinds that are more particular to other cultures, including in the West. And earlier you mentioned transphobia in gay male culture, gay male environments. And so the thing there would be, of course, where do I start with that? But there's a really interesting way in which we get a parallel between dynamics that occur in real life in social environments between so in my case it would be as a queer woman whose primary queer peers and connections and kind of in-group culture is predominantly male and gay. And I think that's a little bit of an unusual position, but it's not only informed my life a lot, but also like it's a big part of my perspective on this kind of media. And I think when we're going back to what you and Talia are talking about with being a detrans lesbian and being a trans lesbian, and how there's this kind of perspective on both that's being talked over and kind of pushed into the back. And yet there's an
Mm.
interest in appealing to this is what I'm finding myself coming back to a lot. There's an appeal to the kinds of bigotry or the kinds of hostility that is particularly harmful to women like you, Emma, and like you, Talia. But it's being appealed to in a way that is disingenuous and is kind of trivializing the problems that queer women like you have. So we say, well, GCs hate this kind of thing, just like they hate detrans lesbians and they just like they hate trans women. And it's like, right, but we got to come back to what we mean. Like Emma gestured at this earlier. What is the definition here of anti-BL sentiment? And in other words, what are we saying should be considered taboo? What are we saying should be considered oppressive? And this is kind of where I see a lot of my perspective coming in, which is there's another kind of queer woman who is heavily affected by this conversation and by these topics. And it's another
Mm-hmm.
perspective that doesn't really get to be there, but it's a perspective that's hidden in the coding of a lot of BL
Mm-hmm.
in particular, which we'll
Mhm.
get to in a second. But one of the criticisms that we can make, and that Talia, I've seen you make, that I've made, that I'm familiar with people making about the kind of milieu around fandom that kind of is predicated on BL consumption and sometimes the BL itself. This can even be true of other forms of like male media. One of the criticisms that we can make is despite appealing to the authority of queer women in creating it and consuming it, there's a great lack of interest in how the dynamics of these fandom spaces or whatever the case may be impact queer women and how they contribute to misogyny against queer women and how there's like Talia was mentioning earlier with the kind of marginalization of FF, like how there's a dearth of queer women's perspectives despite so we are appealing to the authority of queer women, but we're not really actually interested in queer women's perspectives, right? So
The
kind of
irony.
coming back, right, right. So this is kind of coming back to like the joke I opened on with this episode is, I've
Mm-hmm.
made the joke a lot, which maybe is a little bit culturally appropriative, but I call myself the Uke
Oh,
princess, and
absolutely not, honey. Absolutely not. This is your culture.
I mean, that's right, because, but the thing behind that joke is a lot of the appeal for, like, I like BL. Like, there's lots of male media that I've consumed and that I've worked on professionally, like as an editor, or I have, peers that create this kind of media, and a lot of it is very good. I don't think it's in any way absolutely bad, but a big part of the appeal for me of boys love comics and yaoi, which goes way back to like relatively early phases in my life, is that I have tended to, maybe now is a good time to bring up this device that is kind of characteristic of boys love media, which is the uke seme distinction, where we get this dynamic in, it's not certainly not universally held to, and I think it's generally considered to be kind of particular to the Japanese form of it. These are Japanese terms, essentially meaning bottom and top, where you get this very feminized bottom, who is the uke, and you get this more masculine, traditionally male top, who is the seme. And the thing that's always interested me, one of the most interesting things to me as a reader, is I find it really easy to identify with the uke, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the point of it, is that it's meant to be, I see it as like that's what the cis straight female audience is identifying with, right? And so when we kind of when we kind of try to say, well, it's primarily queer women who are interested in this kind of thing, and that's the kind of the take that Aburime is sort of trying to generate here, is that it's mostly trans men or queer women who, or whatever the case may be, who really are into this kind of thing. This perspective of the cis heterosexual woman is not as centered as people think it is. It's one of those cases where I can't say for sure like how everyone feels about it, but it feels very emotionally disingenuous because I know that's a huge part of the appeal for me of consuming it, is that there is this commonality with straight women who are also going to be identifying with this character and this type of character. And that happens to be a kind of person, like a kind of character representation that is very spit upon in a lot of queer environments, including gay men's culture and social environments. And so, this idea that the queerness, the cultural queerness of this type of media is represented in that, it actually depends on, I think there's probably something in common here too between like me and the perspective I'm talking about and the gay trans men that might also identify with the Uge, for example, and how we both have something in common with the cis straight women that read it. There's kind of an erasure of that point of empathy and of the people who are interested in that character and identify with that character. So once it like, my point is, I guess, kind of coming back around to it, is not just that we are appealing to the authority of queer minorities and saying this is actually not the wheelhouse of cis straight women at all, but we're doing that in order to basically say that the reason that any of those people would be interested in this kind of media uh, is not even there. Like we're basically saying that the thing that the gay trans men and the gay and the straight trans women and the straight cis women have in common that might be all liking this kind of thing is not something that media is built around. And that's just, to me, that's just false on its face, because it's like if you actually read it as much as I have, you see that it can't be the case, because otherwise there we go back to the whole like question of marketability of why would this sell? And it wouldn't sell if you didn't have this, basically this emotional locus built into the kind of story we're talking about.
Right, and Aburime here it's not entirely mentioned, but like it's not explicitly explicated here because the paper is very rhetorical,
Mm-hmm.
right? But Aburime here is very clearly, if you're familiar with like the fandom, the discourse around it, very clearly writing in defense of a particular thing and against a very specific argument, and
Mm-hmm.
that argument that is touched on, but like very child touching a hot stove kind of way. So I will explain it explicitly. Okay? The argument here is that because the majority of producers and the majority of the audience consuming BL are women, and that BL, specifically and especially Japanese BL, is written in such a way as to appeal to them and to transpose their dreams, desires, aspirations about romance onto a genre from which female characters are principally excluded, up to the point of manufacturing highly gendered differences between tops, bottoms, alphas, omegas, whatever the hell,
Mm-hmm.
to replicate the dynamics which society constructs as instrumental to straight romance, but into such an environment where women do not exist at all, and therefore these female readers or writers or mangakas or whatever do not have to deal with their pains around misogyny because they have put themselves into a discursive space where everything is the same but everyone is men, or
Mm-hmm.
everyone who matters is men, basically.
And it's this is one of the single most hysteria inducing arguments I have come across when sort of like talking about the quote unquote feminist chops of this particular kind of media,
Mm-hmm.
because oh, there's no delicate way to say this, but like on a really really basic, really fundamental level, this media does in fact construct women whom it then refuses to acknowledge as women.
Mm-hmm.
Because because
Exactly.
what is actually happening, because the things that like both you and May have so painstakingly elaborated on over the past couple of minutes, is that what is fundamentally happening is that we have transposed the feminine, even let's say even the female perspective, into a male body.
Right, and it's like
Exactly.
it's because here's how they're constructed, especially in media that follows the whole semi-uke kind of division very strictly. And this occurs in other cultures too, but it is more kind of codified in this specific genre. Is that the bottom, quote unquote, looks very feminine, often dresses feminine, performs the social role of a woman, is often treated woman-like, but nevertheless is not a woman.
Is the penetrable partner in sex, and
Yes.
and whose penetrability is then juxtaposed with the masculinity, the aggression, the
Mhm.
dominance of the other partner, right? This is fundamentally constructing gender difference without, quote unquote, I hate to use this term, but I'm trying to get a certain point across. This is constructing a certain gender difference without constructing a sex difference, as these terms are popularly understood, and then refusing to comment on the trans femme of it all.
Right. The trans feminine coding of the uke device, I think, is really important to understand the function of why we even have that device to start with. Is like this is something that really interests me a lot as a writer who
Yeah.
I'm very interested in writing stories about trans women that will appeal to cis women. And the uke device is actually one of the first places I looked at when I'm looking at media that was appealing to me, that was also appealing to cis straight women. Is the point, this is, I think, a lot of what it comes back to for me is that the point of this style of character is you synthesize aspects of male homosexuality with female heterosexuality, including the kind of the life interests and social interests that that character would therefore have. And that is kind of exactly what my experience of my life was
Like
like
actual
as a
lived
teenager.
experience. Yeah.
Right, is
Yes.
this is kind of how I tend to parse my sexuality and its impact on my life. Is it blurs those two lines together. So one example here, coming from those specific characters, is you have the boy, you have the uke character who really likes the other guy, and it's clear that the guy, the seme character, really wants to have sex, and he's kind of pressing a little bit, and there's this kind of oh, I'm desperate for you. We have to do this soon, you know. And the uke character has all these reservations, and you can feel sometimes in the text that the writer is explicitly not saying, "Oh, I'm worried about getting pregnant," but they're generating that
Mm,
same emotion. They're generating that feeling of it's a big
that
commitment
tension,
for the
right?
girl. Right, right. You have this big commitment, this big risk for the girl to sleep with her boyfriend in high school or whatever for the first time. And that's going to be one of the things on her mind. So we're kind of building the text so that it's not explicitly what the uke cares about, but it feels like that's what the uke cares about.
Right, and I will point out for the listeners at home that very few gay men care about getting pregnant. In fact, only trans ones.
Right. And so even if we go kind of further than that and say that's just one example, you have a lot of when you look at how relationships between straight women and straight men play out in romance media, and you
Mhm.
have empathy built for the straight woman, hopefully, in this story. Like, she'll generally be more reserved, or she has more risk at play. And it's not always about pregnancy, it could be about a lot of things. Like, there's a lot of historical romance that really delves into how a woman's reputation is more liable to be ruined if she has a dalliance go wrong than the man's reputation will be. That shows up in a lot of yaoi media. Like, there's a
Mhm.
lot of concern for, like, I've read BL comics where there's concern from the uke about being seen as a slut, or
Oh,
interestingly, you sometimes have stories happen where there's relatively little worry about being seen as gay or people finding out they're gay, but there is worry about what I would call kind of feminized perspectives. Like, people will think that I led him on, or the other guy in school that likes me, he'll think I'm a harlot. You know, well, they don't necessarily use that language, but you get this extremely relatable straight female perspective built into this boy character who also may be experiencing homophobia on the page or anti-femininity, something like that. It's really interesting to see how the writers kind of work out these combos, because they end up feeling very realistic, specifically to me as somebody who has like lived both parts of that in different ways. And you have to think they don't. Most of them probably don't realize that, because again, they're trying to create a point where it feels recognizably to be a gay male experience they're representing, but also to be especially relatable to cis straight women. And as it turns out, that is a very trans het kind of construction that they're coming up with. So it's interesting
Yep,
that
inherently.
yeah, interesting that we're appealing so much to gay, and I think gay trans men probably can relate to a lot of that. But we're talking in Aburime's paper so much about that, about who would find this kind of media relatable, but that we never end up landing on that point of there's a kind of queer woman that would, yeah. So
And like that's the main thing over here, right? So this entire paper is an exercise in like staking a particular claim on this fandom. And equating the entire fandom with like a specific identity, with like a specific identification, with a specific experience. And as it does that, it says that like because this fandom is associated with specific identities, all critique against it is
right,
inherently bigoted against those identities. While
right,
itself engaging in a very traditional, very, very common and normalized erasure of the trans feminine perspective that plagues
right,
not merely this fandom, this media, this genre, but honestly plagues media writ large. You know, because
right,
BL is far from the only genre of media where the trans feminine perspective is like constructed
right,
or valued in some way, but then discarded or not named. You know?
right. It tends to show up through sublimation.
Exactly. But if we were to take this paper seriously, if we were to take the premise of this paper seriously, simply pointing that out, simply highlighting the fact that BL media has a historical issue with relying on the trans feminine, the trans het perspective specifically, but it has an issue with relying on the trans feminine perspective while simultaneously erasing it. That is a critique that would count as engaging in
Right.
racist homonationalism
No, specifically transphobia.
against
GC
trans men.
transphobia.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so we're taking, if we criticize trans misogyny, we're being trans misogynist. We're being turf like. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
conclusion we're left with. And like what a lot of this comes back to for me is like again echoing and similar to like what you, Talia, like your earlier point about queer women's media being marginalized is and saying that we construct a woman and then we don't call her a woman or girl, is we have to kind of address the elephant in the room, is that, part of my narrative was this is one of the only places fictionally, like someone listening to this might say, well, May, aren't you basically kind of validating the point that there are marginalized, underserved queer people that get a lot out of this kind of media? And that is basically true. But it's sad that I say that this media depicting boys and men is one of the only places I felt represented. Like it's really sad that that's the truth, because there isn't really media about girls and women like me that was
Mm-hmm.
felt available to me. And I'm certainly not the only kind of queer woman that that's true about. That's kind of what we're all talking about, is each one of us represents a kind of queer woman who is buried and and often ends up needing media that's focused around men and boys to approximate representation for us.
Right, and I will add to this from my wheelhouse that the dear listener, Talia, is the only one here that has never participated in the Fujo fandom in any capacity. Because so have I. And like from my experience, like right, it was very at a certain point in my life, it was very difficult for me to find an abundance of queer media that would feel like it represented something with me or connected
Hmm.
something with me. And the crumbs of FF media that were available to me, I just didn't connect to it because I at the time that was relevant to me and to me and my identity and stuff like that. I just, I turned that on and there was these like pretty wafy girls that are kissing together and holding hands, and I'm like, I don't fucking look like that. I'm a massive bumbling brute. That makes me feel worse. This makes me feel worse. And then the only women that are like me are in these teary documentaries about them getting murdered, and I like
Hmm.
that's fucking sucks. That just makes me feel even worse. And so the only kind of media that I felt sort of connected with something in me was the sort of BL media, because it felt, I mean, retrospectively, right? It felt kind of like it sort of followed some woman-like shape, but at the same time it was abstracted enough and masculinized enough that it allowed me to connect with it in a way that I couldn't connect with the waifs or the brutalized. And there is this kind of sort of interesting parallel, and which I'm sure, by the way, that two gay trans men might have a very similar experience in that case, for perchance different reasons, but all the same. Within this construct of BL and the way it constructs gender, there is this kind of meeting ground of a character that is constructed to be kind of like, I don't want to almost don't want to use the word, but it's like, in terms of trope, it's almost like this hermaphroditic character that is put in the role and the position of a woman, but is always undeniably male. No
Right.
matter what happens, this character will never be called a woman. There is a degree of appeal, this is of like, this is exactly what I have been taught to do, told to do, what I'm supposed to do in order to fit into society, but I get to be called a man about it.
Mm-hmm.
That I could see
So
very easily appealing to gay trans men at the beginning of their self-actualization and transition. And now, obviously, when I encountered FF media that actually did appeal to me, I was like, oh, whatever, I'm never reading that again. But that didn't exist. I didn't have that. And like, again, to reassure the listener, I am not saying that yaoi transitioned me. Please unclench. That is a ridiculous claim. That is a completely ridiculous claim. I'm a human with rational thought and full agency, and I did not transition for 10 years because yaoi. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm trying to say is that there is a very obvious appeal for especially women that feel like they don't fit in. I'm not even going to say queer or marginalized women, because you don't need to be queer to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
For women that don't fit in a world without the meaningful category of woman, where it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't exist. And I find it very curious that Aburime makes this connection between like turf stuff and GC stuff. They don't really distinguish between turf and GC very much, but like GC stuff being and anti-BL stuff being inherently connected. And here's the thing, they don't talk about it, but I do see the connection, because from what I know of the radicalization point for GC women, right, and I know this mainly thanks to reading accounts of ex-TERFs, such as, for instance, our friend Anna from Between Scylla and Charybdis, I believe, Substack, who writes very good essays, who is a de-radicalized TERF that has done a lot of work to work through her beliefs and now explain the sort of rationale behind turfery and why it happens and why it doesn't work, sort of to the general public.
Yeah, so I'm just saying in terms of when I talk about what I know of GC spaces, it comes
Mhm.
from someone who was rather mired in them and was like who is aware of all the different political strains that show up there and who has talked to me about them at length. Like it's a real insider's perspective that many people don't have access to or much idea about. Like these folks
Mhm.
have internal politics that will make your head spin.
Right. And so, Talia, feel free to correct me, because you
Mhm.
know Anna better than me. I mostly know Anna from articles that she writes, but essentially the central point of radicalization for GC women, and you might, listener, you might hear this and observe this to be correct, because you might have wondered how come women argue for essentially entrenchment of patriarchy.
Yeah.
Why are they so committed to arguing on the basis of women's pain? Why can't they ever shut up about it? One of the central points of radicalization for TERFs, in many cases, though not all, is a disillusionment with the idea that any kind of feminist paradise will ever come to pass. They do not believe that it is possible to overcome the oppression of women, so rather than attempt to overcome it, they entrench it, because the category of woman is granted some protections. A woman that is a goodly wife and all that, and a good trad wife, is supposed to be protected by her husband. If the category of woman doesn't exist, then no protection will exist, and men will do to women as they will. That is the
Yep.
rationale behind endlessly talking about female trauma and entrenching themselves into female biology defines women, because they need to make the category of woman stable, because they're afraid that if it's unstable, that if it ceases to exist, that men will brutalize us all without any defense at all.
Yeah. It's fundamentally about the patriarchal bargain. It's fundamentally being like, look, I am in a scary patriarchal world. Feminism is a quixotic, I don't know how to pronounce that word, is a quixotic endeavor doomed to fail. And so just let me make my patriarchal bargain with my one man who will protect me and stop screeching about this abolition of gender stuff, you lunatics. You know?
Right, exactly. And like, here is the thing. So it is basically a to an extent for a lot of GCs, and especially GCs who are cis heterosexual women specifically, because I mean, obviously GCs of all stripes exist, but for instance, lesbian GCs might have slightly different perspectives because they may not have an access to a patriarchal bargain. But it is essentially a fear of female extinction, the extinction of women. What if men no longer had use for women? They will kill us all. And it is fascinating to me then to look at a sort of inverse of that, if you will, within BL, because it is essentially imagining a world in which everyone is men. No such thing as a woman exists. Or like, they do, but they're not important. Please don't talk about them. Please don't put them into our fanfics. They're disgusting. Anyway, so like, where women don't exist, basically. And so it's kind of like they're both linked by the inability to imagine man's extinction. They cannot they cannot imagine a world without exploitation of feminized labor. They cannot imagine a world without men. But they both have a degree of fixation on the extinction of women. And whereas the GC takes a kind of sort of realist pessimist approach, so if there is no such thing as a woman, men have no obligation to protect us, they will kill us all. Then there is the idealist escapist perspective. What if everyone's just a kind of man? Wouldn't that be neat?
We solve gender, everyone. If everyone is a kind of man, then the exploitation of feminized labor will totally disappear by itself. Isn't that right, May Peterson? Hasn't that been your experience?
Oh my gosh. You're just, I mean, no. It obviously, yeah. I mean, that's such a wonderful, like, yeah. So, of course, what Talia is referring to is something I've written and spoke about quite a bit is basically my time, in the closet and so on, where having feminized labor expected of me and extracted from me was a huge part of my experience of, to be kind of simple about it, being a boy. And so when we're talking about this, this has been one of the running themes, right, with BL is the appeal of the style of media is we're constructing a girl into it for girls to relate to, but we're just not admitting it. And so that just shows up everywhere. That shows up in queer cultures, that shows up in mainstream society, that shows up in the GC perspective, right? As we're insisting trans women are men as we sociologically feminize them.
It's a very Ba Sing Se thing.
Right, yeah, it's we don't talk about the woman, yeah.
There is no misogyny among the male body. That is just the trivial experiences of any trans woman would disprove that, and frankly,
Right,
even the trivial experiences of a lot of trans men, to be
right,
quite frank.
right.
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
because because the strictures of patriarchy, its edicts, the structure of misogyny, all of this, so many people wish that it was reducible to simple matters of biology. And in some senses, I think even I do, because you know what? Biology is changeable. Don't you think it would be amazing if
Mhm.
we could transition out of oppression, as like GCs constantly allege trans men are trying to do? But no, you can't, and no one who transitions is doing so because they have any illusions about the fact that their transition will lead to less oppression and less violence. We are transitioning despite the additional hazards transition introduces to our lives. Because this is not a matter of simple biology. This is a matter of ideology. This is a matter of social consensus, and that is more rigid, more stubborn, and more resistant to changing than fucking biology is. Biology is weak compared to that.
Oh yeah.
Oh, baller line.
On that note, May, I really wanted to thank you for appearing on this episode with us and lending us your perspective. I think I speak for both Emma and me when I say that, without your invaluable contributions, this episode would have been, much less illuminating and much lesser.
Hmm. Thank you so much. I appreciate that a lot, and I appreciate you asking me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been Cracked Ivory. This is also the first proper episode that we recorded, so
Oh,
we'll see
wow.
where the growing pains are.
This is
Yes.
going to be the roughest episode. We promise. Hopefully.
Wow.
Yeah. It's also, I realize now, is a somewhat challenging episode because this paper is kind of all over the place and it was genuinely difficult to guide through it in like a consistent way that made sense. Instead of just taking you on a 4-hour wild ride of Sam Burime's conjectures, I tried to you know, dissect it.
Best. It's hard to sum this up, but like, if you want a clean takeaway from this, we should maybe focus on the fact that like epistemic injustice is really baked into certain kinds of media, and like epistemic authority usually isn't enough to redress them. And I don't think we should be discounting entire perspectives just off of the basis of identity politics. And I say this as someone who could win at identity politics if she tried. You know, I have that shit on lock. But it's still a bad way to do discourse and to understand our world. We promise the next episode will be more focused.
The note I would end on with talking about male media is I'm really glad it exists. I don't, my perspective is not to problematize its existence or women participating in it, but I think we have to always hold that in context with the fact that media that represents other kinds of people, like other kinds of queer people, like that represents like women like us, is not really there, and it's not there certainly with the same degree of prevalence as what we're talking about, and that keeps
Which is why we're
getting cut out
creating
of the
it.
conversation, right? Exactly, and that keeps getting cut out of the conversation, and so that's a behind a lot of the criticism of this, and it just needs to be treated more compassionately, especially if we're going to say that this is about protecting the interests of marginalized women and trans people.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah, my summary is that if you like BL, you should transition. I mean, you might detransition, but what the hell?
It's fine.
Why not?
You'll
It's
get
not
there,
so
you'll
bad,
get
I
there
promise.
eventually. You'll get there in the end. It's fine.
Yeah, I did actually do that. I just did it in the wrong way, apparently.
No, I didn't say which way. May, you're doing it. I didn't say
know.
which way was the correct one.
You're right.
We're trying to be inclusive. We're trying to be inclusive. This has been
Thank you.
This has been an episode of Cracked Ivory. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes, as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind-the-scenes content. Follow Talia Putt at taliaputt.com and Emma Zakharuk at dolphindiaries.card.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zakharuk and produced by Talia Putt and Emma Zakharuk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. And a very special thanks to White Mirror, our current cum loudest patron. Thanks for listening.